Hi everyone, it's Sam from the Danger Planet, and today we're going to talk to you about Raid the Vaults, the new strategy in Gaining Grounds 4. With the new release of Gaining Grounds 4 for Malifaux, have decided to do a short series where we're going to be talking about the different strategies and schemes and giving you our input and advice on how to best prepare yourself for these new strategies and schemes, how to win basically. Now these are pretty cool strats. We've got one sort of returning strat that's been modified a bit, one that's just an old strat coming back, and then two brand new ones. So it's really running the gamut of new play styles and old ones. And the schemes, of course, which we're going to discuss separately, add a new twist to any game. The strategy is really the core of Malifaux. It's what both people are trying to do. It's symmetrical. You always know that your opponent is going for the strategy, whereas their schemes are secret. So you can, from the word go, really start trying to deny them. So the strategies are pretty cool this time around. I don't think there's any clunkers. I've played them a few times. I really like them. I think I have a favorite, but I'll wait till the end of the series to tell you which one that is. We're going to be starting with a strategy that should be pretty familiar to people because it was just a variant of a strategy that was in GG3, but with some important differences. And that strategy is Raid the Vaults. It's very similar to Guard the Stash from Gaining Grounds 3. But the way Raid the Vaults works is there are 6 markers on the table. That is 1 in the center of each table quarter, and then 2 on the center line, separated a bit from the center. And this is a very interesting strategy because just from the get-go, before we even get into any more detail, I can tell you that whether you're on a corner deployment, like corner or flank, or a straight up and down deployment, like wedge or standard, really dramatically changes this strategy. And I'll explain why. So the goal of this strategy is to control markers. You control a marker if you have more models within 2 inches of that marker than your enemy does, and models that are insignificant or summoned don't count. Pretty straightforward. You just are trying to cluster around these markers, hold positions. It's actually kind of similar to the primary objective in some other tabletop games, which are often about holding zones. Now, what makes this strategy particularly interesting, though, is that you score, basically, if you can have it control a certain number of objectives, like more objectives than the number of points you've previously scored, at the end of the turn, you score a point. So to score your first point, you need to control 1. To score your second point, you need to control 2, and 3, and then 4. However, the real trick here is if an objective is fully on your opponent's side of the board, it counts as 2. So looks like kind of a minor thing, but it's actually huge in how it makes the game play out. Because if you are on straight deployment, like wedge or standard, there are 2 markers in your side of the board, the ones in your table quarters, that you cannot score. There are 2 on the center line, where they are worth 1 point each, basically, and there are 2 on your opponent's side that are worth 2 points each. And meanwhile, if you are on a flank or a corner deployment, there's 1 in your sort of half of the board that you can't score, 4 on the center line that score worth 1 point each, and 1 on the other person's side that's worth 2 points each. Now, what's really key about this, what makes this so different from Guard the Stash, is that in Guard the Stash, you could only score a maximum of 3 points before having to fight your opponent. You could score the 2 markers on the opponent's side and 1 of the center markers, or you could score on the corner or flank deployment 1 on your opponent's side and 2 of the center line markers. After that, you would have to fight your opponent. Raid the Vaults doesn't work that way. In Raid the Vaults, both players can cap out to 4 points without contesting any of the same markers, because if you score both markers on your opponent's side of the board in standard or wedge, that's 4 points. If you score only the 1 marker on the opponent's side of the board, but 2 of the 4 on the center line in corner or flank deployment, that's 4 points. So right there, one huge difference is that you can cap this strategy without ever having to engage your opponent. That means keep away crews like Zip that are very, very speedy and can get away from your opponent, and force them to come chasing you and never really commit to an engagement. They can actually score pretty well on Raid the Vaults without having to get drawn into a fight that they maybe don't want to have. So that's just something to consider right off the bat. It's a very unique aspect that this strategy has that lets you kind of play past each other. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that these games aren't going to be bloody, but it does mean that you have more options for playing keep away. Now, in general, what are you trying to do on Raid the Vaults? Well, it's kind of GG3-like in some ways, notwithstanding the differences we just talked about. It's very much a strategy about taking and holding territory. You are going to need to place your models in a fairly predictable spot, and when they're in that spot, they're going to need to stay there, and they're going to need to bully opposing models out of that spot. Now, you can't just hire a swarm of small models because they'll just get killed. Another important thing to note in this strategy is that, again, summoned models do not count for control of these objective markers, which means that crews that have the ability to upgrade a model rather than summon it, I'm thinking here like Summer Teeth Jones 2, Ulix 1, Nexus 1, models that can upgrade a weak model like an eyes and ears or a piglet into a tough model. Those crews have some pretty interesting play here because they can hire a certain number of tough objective holders, and then they can hire a couple of small chaff models that can grow up into objective holders. Meanwhile, the more pure summoner type crews, I'm talking things like Asami, maybe Sandeep 1, these models, these crews are going to have a harder time contesting these objectives simply because they're going to be unable to rely on their summons to do so. So their summons are mostly going to be for either scheming or for just killing your opponent off objectives. In general, though, you are going to want a crew that can at least, hold some ground. I've mentioned Zip. I think Zip is okay here, but you're going to want to build a Zip crew that has some punch to it, which often means you're going to have to hire out of keyword, like Auntie Mel's a great out of keyword hire for Zip. Just because you need somebody who can do some damage and make it so your opponent can't just run around the objectives willy-nilly. You need to be able to bully them off and hold space. So this is a strategy that I think by the standards of GG4, which compared to GG3 is much less killy, much less focused on violence, this is a fairly killy strategy. Maybe not as much as some of the others, and we'll get to that later on, and it really will depend on the scheme pool, obviously. Like if you let them bleed is in the pool, then, deathbeds in the pool, that will encourage more killing. But in general, this is a strategy that I think you should be expecting to do some killing, and you should be hiring models that can do some killing. The other thing that's very strong is out of activation movement. Now your opponent is going to be moving and is going to be parking models near the objectives, and once their models are parked near the objective, they're going to want to just be sitting there and not be, disturbed or pushed around. And so if your opponent has a model that they've activated, they put in the objective, and you can push that model away with something like Terrorize or Off the Path, anything like that, then all of a sudden your opponent is no longer contesting that objective and can't put that model back on. And models that end the turn not near an objective are just not contributing to the strategy. Especially later in the game when you really need to control 3 markers or 4 markers in order to score. You can't afford to have models that are just sort of sitting around doing nothing, especially if you've had some attrition, you've lost some models, your opponent's contesting these markers. You just really can't afford to lose that that every single model counting. So you need to be very careful with your positioning. You need to be very cognizant of where your models are ending their activations, and you need to be effective with your out of activation movement to make sure that when you do move a model, you either push an enemy model off an objective or push a friendly model onto one. But if you do have that out of activation movement, you can really surprise your opponent. Like, your opponent will be doing some math and say, well, I have this guy there, this objective has 2 people on it, so all I need to do is get 1 more person onto it, and then I'm guaranteed to get it. And your opponent can have this plan and be really sure that they're totally set, and then you suddenly surprise them with a late end of turn Will of Cadmus or a late Obey or something like that to push a model of yours onto an objective, and suddenly an objective that your opponent thought was safe isn't safe. So this is very much a strategy that I think rewards pass tokens. We've discussed pass tokens on this channel before. I think they're a very, very strong mechanic. I don't think they're quite as strong in GG4 as they were in GG3. And I think that that's especially true in some of the other strats we're going to be seeing, but I think they're very strong here. So another thing that you'd like to be hiring is crews that generate pass tokens. Very, very good on Raid the Vaults. So once you've got your crew hired, you know what you're doing. You got to kind of pick some schemes that work well with this strategy. So an example of a scheme that I think works really well with this strategy is take prisoner. That requires your opponent to have models on your side of the board, because especially on standard or wedge deployment, your opponent needs to come onto your side of the board to take those markers. They cannot rely on the center 2 markers. I mean, even if they have total uncontested control of the board, they can only score a maximum of 2 points by controlling the entire center line. So they need to come to your side. So take prisoner on standard and wedge is a classic example of a great scheme that works really well here. Another example of a scheme that works pretty well on this strategy is protected territory, because you are going to be spreading your models out on the center line, especially on flank or corner deployment. Now you have to be careful, because your opponent could deny protected territory by having models near your scheme markers in the exact same way that they are denying your strategy points, having models near the strategy points. So what you really might want to be doing is running out a little bit past the center line, past those markers, dropping the scheme markers for protected territory out, more than 6 or 7 inches away from the marker that's on the center line. And then your opponent can't get a base without, even a large base that is both within 3 inches of your marker and within 2 inches of the strategy marker. And so they have to really think. Now, it's kind of tough to drop a scheme marker that far away, but you can think about crews that have the ability to drop scheme markers at range, and you can think about crews that have the ability to move scheme markers around. With, Lin Lee can do it, and you've got Drudges in Anya and Doni Ironsides. You have those abilities to move scheme markers where they need to go. Finally, I think killing schemes are just always worth a mention here, because you really are going to be able to pick fights. I think that especially deathbeds, you could just name a strategy marker, and deathbeds is really easy to score here. So that's something to think about. If your crew isn't that killy, you don't have to pick deathbeds, but you should be aware that you are going to be having some fights. So you really do want to bring at least 1 or 2 models that can kill. Now, raid the vaults. Once you're in the game, I think the real key to raid the vaults is figuring out where on the board you can apply pressure and where on the board you can kind of ease off. If your opponent is really committing hard to one marker, like has 2 big expensive models there, maybe you just leave that marker alone, and you're forcing them to have a couple of very big, expensive, valuable models babysitting a marker that's worth 1 point, while you're basically spreading out and controlling the rest of the board. At the same time, if your opponent has, got 1 model running out the flank to contest a marker, if you can pick that model off, if you can kill them and they have nobody else in position, you're denying a whole swath of the board to them, which is going to make scoring in the later turns very difficult. So what you really are looking to do with this strategy is control territory, bully people out of it, but take those opportunities to reach out and pick off a model, a key model that's off on the side somewhere. Also, as I've said, it really depends on whether it's flank or corner or wedge or standard deployment. Flank or corner deployment is going to really encourage you to be stringing out along the center line and maybe sending 1 person way out into the backfield to get that marker. That's one where you can really run past each other. Standard and wedge, you guys are really going to be in each other's faces from the word go. Like, you're either trying to contest the markers on the center line, which are pretty close. They're 4 inches from the center point each, so they're 8 inches apart, which is not very far, especially given that you can control them from 2 inches away. Like, 2 models can be controlling those 2 markers from 2 inches away each, and those 2 models would be, like, I think 2 inches away from each other, because they're 8 inches apart, and then there's 2 inches in on each side is 4 inches, and then 1 inch is a base width. So yeah, you can have, if a model has a 2-inch engage, it can be controlling the left marker, and it can be making melee attacks against a model controlling the right marker, as long as they're positioned appropriately. That's really close quarters. It's claustrophobic. So that's just, something to think about. You don't necessarily have to position your models so they can fight like that, especially if your opponent has better brawlers than you, but you're certainly going to have to put them in harm's way. So I think if I was playing this strategy on standard or wedge deployment, I would want to take a crew kind of like the Clampets, like a bullying crew that can move forward, maybe not even necessarily a bubble, but certainly a crew that can move forward, can be aggressive, can have individual bruiser models that can maybe run out and do some damage, but has a hard core that you really don't want, your opponent really doesn't want to get close to. Whereas if I was playing this on wedge or flank, I would want a crew that's much quicker and able to run people down. So I would say, obviously I've mentioned Zip in this context. Wong is, I think, reasonable on those deployments because, you have these swine curse that can be made fast, and then they can get a, walk charge or walk heroic intervention. And I'm just playing Bayou, but, for my Explorer Society crew, for example, if I'm on Standard or Wedge, I would be thinking Tiri, because she's got that really tough hardcore with the Matron. And if it's more spread out, I'd be thinking maybe McCabe, who can benefit from Hucksters, or even Nexus, who has the ability with, Will of Cadmus to park herself in the middle, and then just really kind of manipulate her models and move them around, and make sure that you're getting edged onto those objectives. It's too bad. I really like the Nexus kids. I think Nexus kids have been nerfed pretty hard, and I'm not sure if they're still viable. But if they are, I think this would be an interesting strategy for them, just because they have that ability to kind of spread out and control lots of the board at once. Although I think they'd be even better at some of the other strategies we'll talk about later. So that's Raid the Vaults. Pretty basic intro, I'd say. The other two strategies that are totally new in this GG are very weird, and I can't wait to talk about them. But we'll get to those. So for now, if you like this video, please drop us a like, subscribe to the Danger Planet for more Malifaux content, and if you have a particular strategy you really like to employ on this strategy, I guess a particular tactic you like to employ, let us know in the comments. If you have a master you think is particularly good or particularly bad even, let us know. You can also join our Discord, where there'll be a link in the description to talk about this strategy, Gaining Grounds 4, and Malifaux in general. So we hope you enjoyed this. Stay tuned to Danger Planet and keep watching. We'll give you all the cool videos on the various different strategies and schemes, and a really in-depth look into Gaining Grounds 4. Till next time, thanks for stopping by the Danger Planet.
Hey guys, Brandon here. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our patrons. Thank you so much for backing us. Special thanks to Seth Prebatch, Nick Kaiser, Nathan Linder, Mr. Nobody, David Meisner, Spilled Paint Pot, Craig Chuba, Jeremy Posner, and Catasunder. Thank you so much, y'all. And if you want to check out the Patreon with some of the cool stuff that we're putting on over there, the link should be below. Thanks so much.